Well, it's 2 o'clock, so welcome to the Economy, Business, Growth and Skills over in the Scrutiny Committee. First of all, apologies for absence. We've got one late one, which is Jane Smith. Next thing on the agenda is urgent business, which I believe that there isn't any. The next thing is declaration of interest. And are there any declarations of interest? And if there are, can you please fill in the form which is in your pack? So the next thing on the agenda is to approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of October. Any comments on the actual minutes themselves? Susan?
Thank you, Chairman. Just to highlight that in our discussion on, forgive me, on the Greater Manchester Strategy Implementation Plan, it's just to confirm a number of members also asked for inclusion of an improved business passenger Manchester Airport experience be included in any work that Greater Manchester does on this aviation strategy. I hope members don't mind me reminding that there seemed support for a member asking that age-friendly Greater Manchester use age groupings for work and economic data that aligns effectively with UK government economic data we regularly use in councils. And actually, the strategy has been published, of course, and there's quite a bit in there about over 55s going to work and so on. So I'd just add that. Thank you very much.
Are members happy to include those constructive observations in the minutes? Yeah. Good. Thank you. If there's nothing else, can we approve the minutes, please? Subject, obviously, to the amendment. Thank you. In terms of matters arising, there are a few items that I'd like to pick up on. On page 2 of the minutes, under the meeting held on the 8th of September, there were 3 resolutions. The second resolution is that I and John Holder would have further discussion regarding the apparent GVA discrepancies as appropriate, and we've had that conversation, and John will now take that up as appropriate. And that the Governance Officer circulates the data and productivity and information in the GM Skills programme to all members of the committee, and that has happened. And then the other thing I think is just important to note that on page 6 of the minutes, and it's the 5th resolution under the Greater Manchester Strategy Implementation Plan, is that what I want to minute in here is that under number 5, that officers take into account the comments of the scrutiny members when finalising the GM implementation plan, is that we have a matrix produced which actually puts down all the points that we've raised, and with a confirmation that they've been adopted, or if they haven't been adopted, because obviously we're making recommendations to the executive, the reason or rationale for them not being adopted. And I think that will make things absolutely clear, crystal clear and transparent from a scrutiny point of view.
Thank you, Chair. On that line, I did ask for an organisational chart to be included.
The organisation chart is in work in progress. It will be issued.
Yes. Apologies, it's not with you yet.
Because I raised the same point today, actually, in the pre-session. But no, we need that. Are there any other matters arising people want to raise? Well, in that case, we can then pass on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Treasury discussion regarding the autumn statement and the government's commitment to the Northern Powerhouse. And I do welcome the Mayor to this committee, and it's very important, in my judgment, for appropriate papers to have your, if you like, political overview on these things. And I'm not sure how you want to handle that, with Jim in terms of the actual presentation. So I'll leave that entirely, in your very capable hands.
I'm going to do the typical politician's hospital pass to Jim then now. And but shall I let Jim do the formalities, then I'll come in afterwards to put the bigger, the political context on.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mayor. Rugby parlance there with the hospital pass, thank you. That's what you expect from somebody who supports Lee, I suppose, rugby league. Okay, so the report in front of you just gives a bit of information and background about the progress with the Northern Powerhouse, and also some of the areas where Greater Manchester made submission to the Treasury for the autumn statement. And as the Mayor said, you know, he's been involved in those conversations, and we'll probably wish to add something at the end of this. So section 1 on the report is just a background and introduction. And the paper itself actually sets out how Greater Manchester is working with the government and partners across the north. And on some of the key elements of what are the region's prime capabilities in the Northern Powerhouse. So that's trade, investment, innovation and culture. So moving over to section 2.2 and 2.3. Since the publication of the Northern Powerhouse strategy, then there has been a Northern Powerhouse team created, and government has committed £15 million worth of funding to actually support some Northern Powerhouse trade missions. And that's been through the DIT, Department for International Trade. That's been through the DIT team. Marion Sudbury heads that up. And the content of the trade missions, we've been feeding into the programme for the trade missions, which is linked into our sector specialisms, particularly our internationalisation strategy that we have, which looks at target markets like India and China, for example, and the USA. So we've been involved in leading, I think, across the north in terms of where these trade missions will go and some of the content of those. Section 2.3 talks about a meeting that Sir Richard Leese convened last week. We're expecting some information from that, but it's actually an attempt to coordinate the approach from leaders, combined authorities, LEPs across the north to collaborate how trade investment across the north can be strengthened. I think it's fair to say on international trade and investment that there are a number of budgets. There is a national DIT budget, there is a Northern Powerhouse DIT budget, and there are also some local Northwest DIT budgets. And the trick really is to combine and use those budgets effectively locally, as well as meeting the national, clearly the national need for targeted international trade and investment. Section 2.4 talks about Innovate North, and there's some evidence and information there about how the universities are using the BAYS Smart Specialisation Unit, and that's actually looking at research development and trying to drive that. Northern LEP chairs did write to the Chancellor in September to raise the profile of this work, and we're hoping that will be mentioned in the autumn statement. Sections 2.5, 2.6, Growth Hub Network. Essentially, as you know, Greater Manchester has a growth hub, which is hugely successful and has been leading the way in joining up the growth hubs across the north to see how they can work better together to support the economy across the north. At the moment, they are essentially supporting their own conurbations, so there clearly is an economy of scale if they work together. 2.7, 2.8, 2.9 talk about how culture features clearly. There is a huge link between culture and growth and economy, and the trick is actually trying to combine those two, making them work together, where one feeds the other. And there's some information in that section about a capital bid, which the DCMS announced. Greater Manchester's LEP is providing a particular bid. My understanding is, since this paper was written, the criteria selected the Rochdale bid on behalf of the LEP to go forward. Transport, well, you'll have seen the Utsel Court opening, and the Mayor was there yesterday. It's a fantastic opportunity, but it's not just about improving the transport just within Greater Manchester. Clearly there's been a lot of work and well publicised, the work between Liverpool and Manchester, which is programmed to be electrified. Transpennine route, there are a number of options being prepared for the Transpennine route. It says in the report that we would benefit from a fully electrified route, but there are other options that are being considered, and the report indicates that it will still perhaps be GM's preference for a full electrification of the line. The paragraph on transport also talks about the need to link HS2 and also Northern Powerhouse Rail together in a very, very effective way, so that one isn't being developed without the other, and there are different programme teams working on that, so it's really within our remit to try and make sure that that works together to the full benefit of the North. Section 213 to 215 talks about the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and I suppose a highlight there is the report which recommends significant investment in the North and makes the economic case for that significant investment, which is indicated in paragraph 214. Section 3 goes on to talk briefly about the autumn budget discussion, and I think 3.4 indicates in bullet points the areas where both obviously senior politicians, leaders and the Mayor plus officers have been having conversation with Treasury and Government about some of those aspects. So you can see, I won't go through them all, but certainly skills and work, there's a report on that later on the agenda. Early years, early intervention, clearly one of the key mayoral priorities, as well as that of the Combined Authority. Science and innovation, infrastructure investment, housing, trade and investment, environment and low carbon, and NHS and social care. So I guess, Chair, the recommendations are just to note the contents of the report and provide any comments. And I don't know whether...
Thank you for that. Before I hand over to the Mayor for the comments, a bit remiss of me that I didn't actually formally record Sir Richard Lee's apologies for this session, this particular item, and also Councillor Farnell's for the next item. So,
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jim. You did it much better than I could have done. But I will provide some, if I may, Chair, some of the broader context in terms of our relationship with the government and the current status of the Northern Powerhouse as I and as we see it. Our aim is to carry on in the spirit with which we've always worked, which is to have a constructive relationship with the government, but a challenging one. So where they get it right, we should say so, but where they get it wrong, we should say the same. And that straightforward approach is the one that I'm seeking to adopt. I have worked with the Prime Minister in the past. I was Shadow Home Secretary when she was Home Secretary, and we dealt with a number of issues together very constructively. Hillsborough, most notable perhaps amongst them. So we have a good working relationship we always have had, and maybe that was reflected in the fact that she came to this very room just a few weeks ago, which was very welcome. You know, we were very pleased that she came here, and I think that's a positive sign of how the government is seeing now. I hope that the whole question of devolution is a part of the answer to the situation that we find ourselves in nationally with the ongoing debate about Brexit, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The argument I put to her that day is that, you know, given that we are going to go through a period of confusion a little, an uncertainty at the national level because of the situation ongoing, devolution is actually a way to break out of that and to move forward on key areas more quickly perhaps than if you go through the old-fashioned route of trying to do it all centrally and all through Westminster, and hope that that point was taken on board. The truth of the matter is, I think the Prime Minister does have a growing kind of understanding of how that's a positive for her and for the government, but it's clear to us that it's not shared across the government. So there are differing views to devolution across the different departments covered in the budget submission. May as well be quite straight about it. The Department for Education, it would appear, are less supportive, and already the timetable that was agreed in the devolution agreement agreement around adult skills has been delayed, and I don't think that's just for technical reasons. And we have a more challenging relationship with the Department for Transport as well. Again, I think not as committed as, let's say, other parts of the government. However, what we want to do is to move things forward, as I say, as constructively as we can, and make the case for devolution. I think one of the things that lies behind all of this, there was a doubt about the Northern Powerhouse after the previous Chancellor left his post, and there's been a kind of year really where things have kind of been up in the air. And I just want to come to the issue in part that Jim touched on, transport, because that was the issue I think that brought it out most obviously over the summer when the Transport Secretary visited Greater Manchester, and taking us by surprise, made comments about electrification, Manchester Leeds, and also investment at Piccadilly. The suggestion being that full electrification might not happen, and that part electrification was the preferred option because of hybrid part diesel, part electric trains coming through, and also that expansion of Piccadilly wasn't necessary because of new digital technology and the ability to manage trains more effectively. Now, obviously that was a change in position, and that kicked off, you might remember, quite a summer of difficult discussions on the transport front. And they are, I'm afraid to say, still ongoing and not clear. Jim's right, there was a very positive event yesterday, the opening of the Ordsall Chord, but the Ordsall Chord, the investment that's gone in there only makes sense if you do the enhancements to capacity at Oxford Road and Piccadilly and then beyond. It's a critical linchpin, if you like, in the Northern Rail system, but it only bears fruit if you carry on the investment. And the truth is we're still unclear what the plans are in relation to all of that. It is, however, coming to a head. We are in discussions via Transport for Greater Manchester and Transport for the North about the thing that brings all of this forward is the final decisions around HS2 at Piccadilly, and I think it's very important that this committee understands where they are up to, because the decisions that are taken are critical. They will have a bearing not just in the short term, but for a century in terms of our economic aspirations. So HS2 are currently looking at their preferred routes for how they design their station at Piccadilly, and it's been communicated that their preferred option is to minimise cost and build on a level. So build in at Piccadilly, out on ground level, and expand, if you like, the footprint of the station. The problem for that, from our point of view, is it creates issues with regard to Northern Powerhouse Rail and the west to east link that comes through, and it becomes more complicated in terms of the throughput of trains. But also, it takes land around Piccadilly that we would see as being the potential for creating a real hub, an economic hub there, with the kind of wider economic and employment development that you could see around a hub train station for the north of England. So this thing is really coming into focus, actually, with this decision that is taken on Piccadilly. And the argument that we're making is, you need to make the most ambitious plan for Piccadilly become a reality, so that we can maximise full economic benefit over the century. So to kind of save a few pounds and many millions of pounds possibly in the budget heading for HS2, actually by doing that you are taking away a whole opportunity to build the northern economy in the future. So that's very much ongoing, but the resolution of that question, I think, will determine the extent of the government's ambitions for west to east rail across the north. In the more immediate term, the issues around electrification and Piccadilly itself, the capacity at platform 15 and 16 is still up in the air, it's fair to say, although those considerations are ongoing. But I think it's worth just touching on all of that, because I don't think you can have a northern powerhouse without substantial investment in our transport infrastructure. The two are intrinsically linked. And I think the resolution of these questions will, I think, determine the extent of the ambition towards building a northern powerhouse. And I think it's very important that we work across party political lines to get the very best deal that we can for Greater Manchester. Just touching very quickly on two other issues, the budget points that have been raised by Jim, and also Brexit number 3. On the budget submission, you'll see there that we've put in an ambitious bid to the government, but ambitious in a good way, not in a overreaching way, to carry forward that point that I put to the Prime Minister about delivering more through devolved structures and making more progress on these key issues. Skills and work is a case in point. We recently had the first ever meeting of the 7 metro mayors in England, now Sadiq Khan plus the 6 elected in May. And there was clear agreement across party political lines that skills is becoming urgent in the context of Brexit, that you cannot be in a business audience without it coming up as a major concern, and that you cannot devise a successful skills policy from the national level. In fact, governments of all colours have absolutely failed to do that over many years. They have prioritised the university route, and they have failed to give adequate focus to technical education. If a skills policy is to work, it needs to be very linked. Your requirements need to be linked to the requirements of your own regional economy and labour market, and then working with your education providers, bringing people through on that basis. All of the mayors said that. All said there needs to be much greater devolution of the skills budget post-16 and control over the apprenticeship levy. As I say, though, we have some resistance in the system to that notion, but skills devolution is a very big part of our budget submission. Just looking down the list, housing, a real positive to report is that the Prime Minister has indicated, and did when she visited, that Greater Manchester would be one of the early areas prioritised for a housing deal with the government. We're hopeful that will be confirmed in the budget, and that will give us hopefully the flexibility that we need to deliver housing growth and put some meaning behind the rebalancing of the spatial framework, which I've talked about, where we might open up sites that have been difficult to open up because of land contamination or because of other complications. This deal might provide us with the means to really refocus housing policy in the way that City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who's leading on these issues, wants to, and that I want to as well. So the housing deal is a crucial piece of progress if we can get the right deal to give us the flexibility then to deliver on our housing ambitions. The other one just to touch on is NHS and social care. Rather than just making a kind of straightforward plea for more money, we are making a plea for more money, but we're doing it in the context of asking the government to consider making Greater Manchester a pilot for the reform of NHS and social care funding, moving away from the activity-based tariff, which pays the NHS by the number of people who come through the hospital door, and moving much more towards a preventative person-based approach where funding is consolidated and we work on a year of care principle where the priority and the incentive should be to support people properly in their own home rather than leaving them unsupported in the home to drift towards a hospital bed. So it's quite a substantial proposal that has gone in to the government. It recognises, and it's based on the fact that with the level of NHS devolution that we have here, we're the only area that could mount a proposal of this kind, with the ability to link the NHS to housing and to other areas of public policy. And happy to talk more about that if it's of interest, but it's a bid that is in with the government and is a serious piece of work. Lastly, Chair, just to touch on Brexit, because all of this is linked, I think, to the extent to which the Greater Manchester voice is heard in the Brexit negotiations. All of it won't make any sense at all if a deal is done that doesn't respect the ambitions that we have for our own economy and our own infrastructure and development. For the first time, the mayors, northern mayors, actually collectively met David Davis recently. It's the first time we've met him, but it was very welcome that we did. However, the Mayor of London, I understand, meets David Davis on a monthly basis, and the call was made for much more regular and meaningful engagement, because we're getting into a period now when the deal starts to be done, or various deals start to be done. It becomes very serious for us. My fear all along has been that top of the list of industries that the government will wish to protect will be the City of London and the financial sector because of its tax raising contribution to the country's finances. The danger there, of course, is that if one area is protected and if Europe knows that one area is the priority, maybe the trade-offs are done in other areas that could then hit the regional economy. We send 58% of our exports from Greater Manchester to the EU, compared to the national average of 44%. And I made the point to the Brexit Secretary that from our point of view at least, no deal was definitely a bad deal because we are more reliant on Europe for our exports. You know, that was a first discussion. There's been agreement that there will be more engagement at official level via Simon and his team with Treasury officials. But we were told that there hasn't yet been any regional analysis of the impact of Brexit and the various scenarios, which I find, to be honest, a little worrying. There's been a sectoral analysis, but there hasn't been a regional analysis. And what we see in the absence of that from the government, IPPR reporting today or yesterday, that depending on the nature of the deal, it could be much more damaging for the north than it is for the rest of the country. And this is a risk that we have to be very alive to. So, apologies, Chair, for quite a long scene setter there, but I think it's important for everything that Jim talked about, all the specifics we're interested in, they will only be deliverable if we are managing this wider relationship with the government correctly and reading the mood of the times and putting our arguments accordingly.
Thank you both the Mayor and to Jim for that. But before I throw it open for questions, I mean, I just want to make a couple of observations, really. First of all, it's absolutely, this is cross-party. The support, I mean, we mentioned this at our last meeting, the importance of, that we don't, if you like, drag petty politics into this. We support the devolution agenda, and it's great to hear that the meetings you've had with the other mayors, there's consensus there as to what should happen. And the other thing, I think, you know, it's good that you are obviously engaging with government, that there appears to be support from government at certain levels, and obviously, hopefully at all levels in due course. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing that I was always worried about, you know, not just with potential with Brexit, but in general terms in this country, is getting the skills right. And a lot of my background is in that sort of area. It's absolutely fundamental, and you're absolutely right that these things need to be tailored to local needs. So I would agree with you entirely on that. And finally, as well, you know, if you want to connect everything together in the north, you have to have proper communications. And you make some very good points. I think the fact that you said it was quite an extensive, you know, introduction, I think that's welcome. I mean, this is so important for all of us going forwards. So we welcome that, and clearly we welcome you back to other appropriate meetings, which I'm sure your time is very precious. So thank you for that. Thank you for Jim as well for the detail. Questions?
Thanks very much, Chair. I've got two questions. The first question is that the paper, Jim Taylor's paper, says GM is in discussions with government about further devolution to ensure the Greater Manchester strategy can be delivered in full, and you do list us your priorities. My question is, I hope you don't mind, can you explain, Jim and the Mayor, can you explain more, please, how this relates to, by 2020, 60,000 more Greater Manchester employees will earn above the real living wage, and also there will be reduced inequality in economic outcomes in Greater Manchester.
I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, thanks. Jim will come in and correct me for the inaccuracies that I... yeah. No, Lee will pick up the ball here from Salford and do the running. Just on your, if I may, before I get into Susan's question, I think you're right about the cross-party side of things, because we're in a moment here where, for me anyway, as I come into this role, when I know the result I got in May meant that people of all political views maybe gave me their support. So it is place first, party second, definitely. And you know, it's my role to work on that basis, and I will work on that basis, both with all of you in this committee and other committees under the GM structure, but also with the other mayors. I think if the North is ever to make real progress in getting our voice heard and getting more control over our own future, then it's now, and we shouldn't let anything jeopardise that, in my view. So I appreciate and grateful for what you say. To answer your question, I mean, the thing we've done, as you'll see in the Greater Manchester Strategy, is we have set quite a big picture ambition. And some might say that it's bigger than necessarily all of the individual powers that we've got. Of course, the role of mayor does bring a convening power and an ability to ask businesses to work with us in a certain way, and also colleges and schools. And I don't think the lack of direct devolution on certain issues should stop us setting out our ambitions and trying to move forward. When it comes directly to those questions of economic inequality, just two points to make. One, you'll have seen this week that the GMCA has been accredited as a living wage employer. And our aim in seeking accreditation was to be able to send a message throughout the GM system that we would want others to do the same. I think Greater Manchester Police are now looking at following suit. There is a leadership role here in setting out standards in terms of what we would hope for the Greater Manchester economy. And Sir Richard Lees will soon begin a consultation on what we're calling an employer's charter, or a GM good employers, because it's not just pay, is it? It's the insecurity that many people in GM face, and it's whether we can do something about those things without necessarily having all of the levers that we control. However, to make a slightly broader point, the logic of the issues, the way we've crafted the Greater Manchester Strategy is about, in the long term, providing solutions to this. So you'll have seen, Susan, that we've got a focus on school readiness, because if kids are not arriving at school in reception class, as you know, ready to learn, then they won't fulfil their potential, they'll fall behind, and then they won't be in a position to get the skills and qualifications they need. And then beyond there, we're looking at life readiness at 16, work readiness. So how do we support teenagers through that crucial transition from school into study or work? So what we're trying to do is put the right foundations down that creates a more productive, more equal society. So working at this on a number of levels. So it's a long-term vision. It's not just quick fixes. We're trying to think this through, because the skills has become urgent because of Brexit, and I think employers can see that before we know it, there may be gaps opening up in the workforce, and we have to move more quickly. And it might mean that we need to think differently about employment and standards of employment to get people into the positions that we need. So these debates are becoming very, very urgent, I think, and as ever, we want Greater Manchester to be at the forefront of them.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Very much welcome what the Mayor's had to say with regards to cross-party engagement, and I think that's the spirit which we're all taking this work forward. But it's important to say it, and important, particularly if I might say so, to come directly from yourself at the very top. I wanted to just try and, there's a lot of good things in the report, and what Jim said and what you said yourself, a lot of engagement with central government, which has got to be the way forward. It's got to be a positive, whatever one thinks about the politics of it, that the Prime Minister has actually been here in Manchester. In fact, as you said, in this very room, those are all positives. But never mind the long term, in the short to medium term, you referred, Mayor, about the ambiguity over the last 12 months. I don't think that was the precise word you used, but about the future of the Northern Powerhouse. And I just wonder if you share some of my concerns about this going forward, about how committed the government is in practical terms to the future of the Northern Powerhouse. And I say that because everybody understands it was the creature of the previous Chancellor. I know he is still at least nominally involved now because he chairs the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and I accept he believes in it fully, but you're certainly right to say there was that hiatus the last 12 months about whether or not this was going to be taken forward? And do you think we can be confident that in a couple of years' time this is going to have... I know I'm asking you to crystal ball gaze to an extent, but I just feel that the commitment is not what it was, and that the Prime Minister recently has, to be fair to her, made an effort to try and reassure us here in Greater Manchester that the Northern Powerhouse is still definitely a part of her agenda and on track. But prior to that, since the general election, you know, it had all gone pretty quiet. And I agree with you, you know, travel in hope, but I think we should be wearing a tin hat just in case as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, we certainly do travel in hope, and we've had a lot of good words from the government in recent times through the conference, and I met most of the relevant cabinet ministers at the conference, including the Chancellor, and then the Prime Minister, as I say, came here the following week. Lots of good commitment and lots of things that we would want to hear, but it will be deeds, not words, that in the end determines whether or not the commitment is real. And I think we're coming close to finding out, really, because I think the budget is a key moment in this. There is the question of what is said about the North and transport in the budget, and you know, I would be watching that very carefully if I were all of you, and I will certainly be too, because with the best will in the world, this could in the end become a choice for the government. So the reason why things got very difficult in the summer was because at the same time as the Transport Secretary came here, what appeared to be a downgrade to our plans for electrification, a day or two later he gave the biggest of green lights to Crossrail 2 in London. And the possibility is it will in the end become a choice of whether it is Crossrail 2 or whether it is substantial investment in the North. If the two things could happen at the same time, well, fine. You know, as a former Treasury Minister, and you know, you've been in those circles, Mark, I mean, I kind of doubtful about that, because I doubt there are two £30 billion cheques beyond HS2 floating around the Treasury. So if it is going to be a choice, you know, am I confident yet that we're the first choice? Well, no, not yet in that position. So I think we're about to find out, really, in terms of, you know, but let me be fair about it. You know, the Prime Minister did indicate that we would be an early housing deal, which was good. She did say on the day she came that finally the money that we've been promised actually for homelessness through a Trailblazer would be released, which was £3.8 million. We did, I think, because of the pressure over the summer, get an announcement out to the Chancellor at his conference of £300 million, what they call the touch points between HS2 and any potential Northern Powerhouse rail scheme. Again, a sign that built some confidence. However, I pick up whispers of what's being promised to the West Midlands, and you know that may be, you know, more than what we're being promised. So, you know, these things are in the balance, I would say, right now. But I do think, in terms of where we are, the government will be wise to embrace devolution and re-energise its Northern Powerhouse project.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I can congratulate you on the living wage. I think that's a big positive movement for the Greater Manchester, and I hope others can take this suit, including other local authorities. My question is revolving around early years intervention. You spoke very passionately in the Greater Manchester Voluntary Organisation the other day, and you want to see this equity distribution. Now, I don't know whether you described it. Devolution is like the bus without an engine. So I don't know who's it, but there's a quote out there. Certainly, we need the appropriate resources. Sure Starts was there, and it was pretty much working, but it's no longer there. Do you see a model around there? And my second question, Chair, is around Greater Manchester transport and low carbon. There is a trajectory from the City Council itself going to see zero carbon coming up fairly soon, but with the diesel engines and the buses, what do you see how you can regulate this type of behaviour from the bus companies? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. I mean, the great opportunity of the devolution deal that we have here in Greater Manchester, it seems to me, is to break down the silos between different public services and start with the person and move to a very preventative approach to the way we support people. And that should start in the very early years of life. You know, we have had a situation perhaps at times where public service say, well, we're not making the investment if another service benefits and all the rest of it. If you start to move towards a single commissioning approach, which is the direction of travel in Greater Manchester, I think you take that stuff away and you start to think more about what's the right thing to do, what's the right priority to have, both for people, but also in terms of then getting maximum returns to the public purse because of intervening early and being more preventative in our approach. So this thinking has taken us in the Greater Manchester strategy to prioritise school readiness as a central focus for the public sector, and this has been discussed at length in the Public Services Reform Board, which I chair. It's been carefully chosen. I mean, it builds on a lot of good work in Greater Manchester over recent years. Most of the authorities represented around this table, well, all probably, have been working on the early intervention, the early years model that has come through in Greater Manchester that has made great strides actually in recent times. So we're building on really strong foundations, but we're still at a point where a third of kids arrive in reception class not school ready. So let's say 40,000 is the intake every year. It's probably a little bit below that, but let's just say that. Latest statistics suggest that 13,000 of those 40,000 are not school ready, and we're some way below England average. And I would, going back to Susan's question, until you change those figures, I don't think you are bearing down on inequality in the way that we would all want to. And the reason we've chosen school readiness as a kind of shared priority for the public sector is because it unites council, NHS, because obviously people think of 0 to 4 as being council and NHS in the lead, and then 4 onwards, the primary school takes over. Well, actually, you've got school readiness is the bit that just links the two, isn't it? Where everyone's got the shared interest in improving those outcomes. And the discussion that we've had here is kind of around getting that 12,000 down every year, and not just thinking about numbers, but thinking about names. You know, how do we get health visitors involving primary schools at an earlier age? You know, if kids are not on track at age 2, well, let's have that information shared with the education world so that interventions can be brought forward to get those kids in a position when they're where they're kind of already catching up the ground that they may be losing. So that's what we're trying to do. And the answer to your question is it builds on Sure Start, but it isn't, you know, Sure Start, I was a member of the government that brought it through and I'm very proud of it. However, some might say it became quite self-selecting in terms of the groups that used the Sure Start centres, and it didn't necessarily always reach those who most needed the support. Perhaps it did sometimes, but not always. Whereas this approach is about saying, who are those 13 or 12,000 kids in Greater Manchester? You know, what are their names? Where do they live? And actually then actively targeting support on those families, recognising that many of them may be earning below the living wage or doing 2 or 3 jobs or on a 0 hours contract or in private rented housing where they may be living in fear of eviction. You know, their lives are complicated, and supporting them so that they can support their children is something I think we should be thinking about. So the answer to the question is it obviously learns from that kind of decade of Sure Start, but it's actually trying to take it to a whole new level where all public services are collaborating critically with the community and voluntary sector, because you mentioned that. You know, we can't do everything from public money and public bodies working in a particular way. If we're to achieve our ambitions for the Greater Manchester, you have to unlock the full potential of the community and voluntary sector, in my view. And that's why we're talking about a different relationship with them that's based on longer term funding, core funding, so that they can maximise their contribution to these initiatives. So that's an important question, but I hope that just gives you a flavour of where we're coming from. On transport and moving to less polluting forms of transport, we'll shortly be initiating quite a large piece of work around use of the powers in the newly passed Bus Services Act. So obviously the call that Greater Manchester had made over many years for the power to re-regulate the buses is now a reality, and the fact that the bill is through Parliament. The orders underpinning the bill are not fully through yet, but they're coming through, we've been assured. So in 2018, we will be able to move on with our plans to use those powers to improve bus services here. And the truth is, we're going to have to decide what we most prioritise in that discussion. So is it lower fares? Is it disability access to our buses and ramps and audio-visual announcements? Is it route coverage? Or is it electric or hydrogen buses? Or maybe it's all of those things, or maybe it's a mixture of some of those things. But you know, what we're going to have to do is kind of really be clear about what we want as we move to this really different public transport system in Greater Manchester. And I would hope, as part of it, we can make progress on less polluting buses and use this change that we're bringing through to be a change in the way in which buses are powered, and hopefully use the whole reform of bus services in Greater Manchester to begin to provide answers to the air quality problem that we've got.
Cecile.
Thank you. There's an undoubted north-south divide nationally, and then I know that you're passionate about making it more of a level playing field in everything you do. But there's also a north-south disparity within the conurbation. Can you tell me what strategies you are prioritising to bridge that gap?
Thanks, Cecile. You're right about that. I spoke about that in the mayoral election, you may remember. I think we can be rightly proud of the economic turnaround in the city centre and Media City and other parts of Greater Manchester in the last 20 years. But I feel in the next 20, we need more focus on the outlying towns, the outlying areas, to see if we can improve their fortunes and apply some of the same lessons learned here to there. So the most specific answer I can give to your question is next week I will launch what we're calling the Town Centre Challenge. So as part of this desire to refocus the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, I want to take a more focused look at the potential of our towns to deliver housing growth, but also as part of that to breathe new life into them, you know, to bring a new generation of people to live in them, to begin to turn around their fortunes. So what this involves is initially asking all 10 of our districts to nominate a town that will be the recipient of focused attention from me and the team here with regard to how we can develop, let's say, a master plan or proposals both to improve housing, transport connections, but also turn around the fortunes of some of our towns. It's based on the reflection that, and I'm speaking and looking at Charles here, Councillor Lee, and he and I worked on issues related to Lee Town Centre for many years. It's based on the realisation that many towns like Lee, and we've got many of them across Greater Manchester, are not going to be the retail destinations that they once were. And by trying to cling on to that, I think that is part of the problem, because you get pound shops, charity shops, and people feel that the place is not moving forward. The time, I would say, has come to embrace a new future for some of our towns and to think of them more as places that could have more town centre living, in the same way that city centre did this 20 years ago. You know, it kind of embraced the idea of more city centre living. Well, let's embrace more town centre living, attractive, modern, high-quality residential development. You know, Bury, I think you could look at as a bit of a model in this regard, in terms of the way it's linked high-quality retail to new residential, and see if we can begin to kind of rethink how they're working, and then improve their fortunes, and then rebalance Greater Manchester as a result. So That's the thinking. I mean, what would it mean directly? Well, it would mean me convening public and private landowners in those particular towns, which we would do, and perhaps in this room and in a meeting like this. We would ask them all to start to think about what they could contribute to a plan for whichever town it might be. There are powers at my disposal, which comes with the role around mayoral development and compulsory purchase. So there are powers of intervention that can facilitate development, and alongside the housing deal that I mentioned, that might help too. So you can see where I'm going. I think the public want to see us do more to put more housing in our town centres linked to transport before we take precious greenbelt. And now I'm not saying that won't still be an issue we've got to confront. You know, the need to build in places where there is still controversy. However, I very much want to start with a plan that looks at the potential of our towns to deliver a good portion of our housing growth. I hope that starts to refocus things and rebalance things in the way that you want.
Yes, I think we all agree that the town should be developed, I'm sure, but places are different, and sometimes, you know, if you're bringing new people to the town centre, you're not bringing industry, manufacturing, big business, high-tech businesses. They don't want to be in the town centre. Well, we have some in Rochdale, but a lot of them want big premises outside of the town centre. And are you going to, you know, look at that as well?
Oh, no, absolutely, no question. Behind this plan that Jim took us through, well, I think it actually mentions the high-tech sectors, doesn't it, that we want to focus on. You know, I think it lists them. I think the sectors that were identified in the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review. I'm sure I saw it somewhere in our...
I think there's life sciences, advanced manufacturing, digital, you know, health, lots of science innovation. So there are a number that are listed there in the report.
So, you know, absolutely, we want to see Greater Manchester have a growing strength in all of those areas, linking with our universities, businesses big and small, and obviously all the business growth team here. And yes, that sits alongside. I was just trying to give you a specific example. I do think we need to sort of put some quality back into the heart of our towns to make them more attractive places both to live and to invest. Because that can be the thing that really then starts people thinking differently about the different boroughs. So you've got to start somewhere, is what I would say. So I'm not ruling out at all those plans, but I think it's about, you know, starting where you can, and particularly starting with housing, which is obviously, you know, industry. We might get it, we might not. We'll certainly work hard to bring it in. Housing, we need it, and we know we're going to have to build more houses in the years to come. So let's think through how we build that housing in a way that delivers maximum benefit to our existing towns, and actually doesn't necessarily go straight to the places that are the green fields that people prioritise, and therefore will put more cars on the road. You know, we need a more sustainable vision for Greater Manchester that balances it, but also keeps it moving. I wouldn't disagree, but the economy is changing, don't forget, and the large employers that, you know, we can't necessarily work on the basis that there are plenty of them. We need to think as well of startups, don't we? And I am thinking, when we think about town centres, of residential and employment, so more high quality startup space in our smaller towns linked to residential development, you know, that's something we should be thinking about as well.
I'm conscious of the fact that we're actually running out of a lot of time for this particular session. It's been obviously very interesting. I didn't see any more hands up, although Roy at the last moment put his hand up. So I'll leave one more question, and then I think we really do need to move on, because I want to make a couple of observations, and obviously to thank, if you like, the Mayor for his observations. So Roy.
Easy under our one. But it's one that intrigues me. There's a lot of talk of the North. I happen to come from Sheffield and Proud. and we always said the north began in Sheffield. And then when motorways were built, it started saying to the north, beyond Leeds and so on. Now you've got the wider north, the greater north, the far north, and you've got the great exhibition of the north in Newcastle. Now, even at Newcastle, it points to the north up the A1. So it's a serious but short question. What is, in your view, who you cooperate with, who we work with in the north? I mean, I know we talk about Liverpool to Leeds, but I have a bias. I travel on the train regularly to Sheffield, and it's a big city and quite a region. And I just wonder, you can't cooperate with everybody from Carlisle to Crewe and so on. What is the north on in this section on culture, particularly? The north, in your view?
Thanks, Roy, I think. We're getting to existential questions, aren't we? What is the north? And no, it's a good thought. What is the north? Northwest. Well, I'll answer it as best I can. Northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber, northeast, and Cumbria. So I'm talking of northern England, and I'm thinking of those regions. I'll be honest. I mean, I hear the debate that's going on with devolution in Yorkshire at the moment, and it's not for us to intervene in that. I think if they got a devolution deal, it would be good. But I do think the sub-regions like ours as the building blocks, and then developing a northern voice from those building blocks is a good thing. Is the way I see it. So, you know, we have been talking along. You mentioned the Great Exhibition of the North. I've met other northern leaders, and there is thinking about whether or not we bring together the North on, let's say, a couple of times a year in a permanent representative body that can advocate for the North. Now, that wouldn't be on every issue, because every issue shouldn't be dealt with at that level, but transport clearly should. And we're going to need, for the reasons I gave earlier, we're going to need to speak clearly and loudly through this process with all of these issues around Crossrail 2 coming up. I would also say on skills, we probably have common cause. Brexit, the same. And also possibly the case for more devolution of power out of Westminster. So there is a clearly defined set of issues where I think if the North did speak with one voice, we would probably all benefit collectively, and we would get our voice heard, and our voters, I think, would like to see the North speaking more forcefully on the national stage. The way I look at it is a very last point, Chair, if I could. If you look at where devolution was delivered here in the UK in the last 20 years, London, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, their voices got a lot louder in that time, and I think it's added to the sense of dislocation that some of our voters feel. You know, what about us? You know, they're getting all these things, and Northern Ireland got money recently, and I just think devolution should be good for us doing things differently ourselves, as we like to do, but equally building out a stronger voice together with other northern partners. And it's certainly part of my intention that we do that, because the rail investment is the obvious example. You know, we are more likely to get more if we do that together.
I've had a plea from Susan. I have one very short question, and can I have a short answer as well, please?
Actually, I was very generous, because I did say I had 2 questions, so I was a little embarrassed that I didn't ask my second question. But it's about the priorities that are listed in the paper under the section Autumn Budget Discussion Update. Yes, I'll be very brief. So I want to ask whether it's not there as a priority, so is it something that's under consideration, and perhaps a commitment? The business of, are you considering the out of work and the not work agenda too, which I recognised is the area of the Department for Work and Pensions in Greater Manchester that residents, obviously we've got those that are out of work and not working. Is that being considered? I'm just interested because it's not listed as a priority. Thank you.
I could say something about that, and Jim may want to come in. I mean, the skills package is obviously in that space. So I mean, there is some devolution from DWP at the moment, although it's not huge. But there's a working well programme in Greater Manchester to try and get people with long-term illness and conditions into the workplace. So there's some focused work going on going on there. I've been very clear that my long-term ambition is to see much greater control over the DWP budget here. To answer that question and to link it much more to the work we're doing with our colleges and businesses with relation to skills. So it is a part of our agenda. Jim, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. There are 220,000 residents in Greater Manchester who haven't worked for at least a decade or more. And part of the skills and work section there is a programme called Working Well, which is targeting 50,000 residents across the conurbation, which is different to a ordinary DWP programme because it involves health support as well as just a job search, for want of a better explanation. We also have learning and training inside prisons as well for people who need training and help and support. That's a joint government and GM initiative. There's also integrated employment support for older people as well, which is part of the programme. And also looking at improving business productivity and looking at initiatives for people at work who perhaps suffer for ill health and how we can make that better. And you'll be aware that productivity in the UK is one of the lowest of the G7, G8, and in the Northwest and in GM in particular, you know, we are one of the worst in the UK. So clearly these sorts of initiatives are there to help some of our most vulnerable residents, but also to help, you know, the productivity and a pathway to work, which then gives those people an opportunity to contribute to more to society, really, in those terms.
Thank you. Well, if I can bring this session to a close, we do welcome, if you like, your thoughts. The tone from the top is important, vital in any organisation. I do welcome the observation that you gave to Cecile about, if you like, looking around the whole conurbation, getting jobs out to the periphery, creating more wealth there. And I've got a vested interest, because I also represent Rochester as well. And there is this disparity across the... But having said all that, of course, a lot of people who actually live in something like Rochester commute into Manchester. I mean, I was a case in point. And also, I think you're absolutely right, you know, in terms of what the vision is for development city centres. Again, I worked in the city of Manchester, you know, for a long, long time, and seeing that place being transformed. And to be fair, actually, that was doing because there's great collaboration between business and commerce and the Manchester City Council. And the development, you know, in terms of housing in the area is fantastic. So I'm not saying you can do that everywhere, but it's, you know, I think you can build and reflect on these sort of things. So, you know, we look forward to the update in the autumn statement. I hope we get what we want from the government. And that's clearly, you know, we're batting with you, you know, from that perspective. I think the autumn statement is about the 23rd of yeah. So I'm not sure what the practicality will be in terms of written report coming to our next committee, because that's on the 8th of December. But I think an update will be very, very welcome. But I think we need to get the mechanism right in terms of it's an urgent business item or a detailed report or whatever.
Yeah, Simon and colleagues will be producing a summary of key issues arising from the budget statement, which will be available very shortly after the statement itself, so we can certainly bring that to you for a discussion at your next meeting.
Yeah, that'll be fine. Yeah. So many thanks from your precious time. Thanks, Jim, as well. And if you want to go, you can go. I know you're a busy gentleman.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, it is appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, the next report is on digital business. Now, we are, I say, behind schedule. I'm conscious of the fact that last time we overran, and people have commitments, particularly childcare commitments. So I want to make sure that we focus on what's important, and we actually do finish this meeting on time for 4 o'clock. So I think the idea would be do on the next report is assume that people have read the report detailed report, and therefore, if Margaret, you can just give me a 1 minute sort of overview, in terms of it, and then I'll throw it open to questions.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Chair. It is actually a fairly short report, and it aims to bring together the work that's been going on already to put together the Greater Manchester Digital Strategy with its corresponding action plan behind it. And it's really asking Scrutiny for a view on the 5 themes that we think should lead the digital strategy. They're in section 5, and you can read them yourself. And then the measures of success, which are in section 6, in the table format, and then the final page on there really is a summary of the support that we've got from the Growth Company into business, both supporting this agenda and also supporting the strategy. And the paper sets out the structure that we've put together in terms of a digital steering group and the businesses that are involved to bring this strategy together. The Mayor's next summit is on the 8th of December, and members of this committee are invited to that if they want to come. I think the only thing to add, Chair, is that it does say that we would bring the draft strategy and action plan to the meeting of the next committee on the 8th of December. That's actually the same day as the summit, and that's not realistic, so if we could say that would be January instead. Thank you, Chair.
Susan and I have discussed that already, in fact, and I think because it's on the same day of our next meeting, I think what the suggestion might be is that the Chair and Vice Chair perhaps be invited to come along to your day of discussion before our meeting, and then we'll see your detailed report coming in due course. But the detail I'll let you just sort out with Susan. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good, okay. So
Sorry. On page 6, halfway down the table, it mentions accelerate market investment in our full fibre infrastructure across GM, including securing DCMS funding. Chair, I'm view of the time, I'm not expecting an answer to this in full, but I wonder whether you could perhaps circulate to us and outline what sort of speed you're aiming for, how you're going to fund the private sector people who provide the network, generally like that, and just enlarge on really how you're going to do all that and what the timescale of it would.
Certainly can. That would be in the full action plan, but just to let you know that to the Combined Authority at the next meeting there will be a paper that asks for permission to bid into the next round of government funding for infrastructure across Greater Manchester. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask about the 5 themes and the line that says inclusion, ensuring no one is digitally left behind. And when I read that, I'm sorry, I just came to the conclusion, but they are already left behind. And the variance, I feel, I've not got the full data on this, but the variance I feel is already quite wide. And I do remember reading some assessment work that had been done in Salford that's published about some of the poorer parts of Salford, where there was really quite stark and shocking poor access, poor level of access. It was part of their poverty work. Poor level of access to digital, to connectivity. And any comment you can give me on how that is going to be tackled. It's a big today problem, is it not, in some parts of Greater Manchester? Thank you.
Yes, you're completely right, and I think that's why it's one of the 5 key themes for inclusion, and there is a subgroup sort of sets out down on one of the pages that that group about inclusion has representatives from the Economic Partnership, Health and Social Care Partnership, business, public sector, really to try and pick up those groups of people who may already be left behind and not get left further behind. I can't give you any more detail than that because that's currently being worked up by that subgroup, which will come back to the next steering group and will be discussed at the next summit in December.
May I ask then, Chairman, that could you ask that subgroup to look at that work that was carried out in Salford? Thanks very much.
Mark, next. Oh, sorry, Eamon, do you want to comment on that?
Right, just to mention one thing. Clearly this is about the digital work, which is contained within the work stream that Margaret's leading, but digital inclusion is a key component of an awful lot of other things that we're doing as well. So I was with a group of workers who are now working with GPs in Oldham and Rochdale. We're hoping to roll it out much further. And one of the key focuses for them is dealing with people who are digitally disconnected from access to healthcare and support because they just can't access the systems. So one of the most important skill sets they're bringing is actually enabling people to utilise digital technology or to support them in doing that for that inclusion. So that's arising directly out of our health and social care work rather than from the digital work itself. But there is an awareness of that digital exclusion that, as you rightly say, already exists, and we need to deal with it where it manifests itself, as well as future-proof for future generations.
Yeah, I think my point is linked to what Susan was just saying about ensuring nobody's being left behind. The indices that are listed on page 5 is interesting because I guess they're there suggested as measures of progress, but the final one jars with me a little bit. People who use the internet to do online banking. Now, don't misunderstand me. Anyone who wants to do online banking, that's absolutely fine. But it isn't the choice of everybody to do online banking for various reasons. Some of it may be generational, some of it may be simply because they don't trust the security aspects of it, all kinds of reasons. But I don't understand why that is there on that list of indices, because it seems to me the banks themselves are forcing more and more people to do online banking, whether or not they want to, because they're reducing high street services. Now, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding the context of why it's here on the end of this list of indices, but certainly an increase in the number of people, whatever age, using internet banking is not necessarily, to me, a sign of success or progress. Am I misunderstanding this?
Can I just jump in? Because I actually raised this exactly the same point with Helen beforehand. In detail, but I'll let Helen or Margaret do it.
As Councillor Holly says, this was brought up before. I think that the first thing to say is this set of potential indicators is very much sort of draft for debate, consideration, challenge. I think on that one, where we started was a composite indicator of digital inclusion, a sort of digital inclusion heat map, which may have been similar to the measures that you're referring to, which included sort of various indicators, including access to using social media, using the internet to access employment opportunities. Online banking was one of them. So what the intention was there really was what we're trying to look to do, rather than have an incredibly long list or be too general, is pick out something that is the most appropriate proxy that sort of says, well, if we're doing very well against this, then there is a set of things we have to have done in order to do well against this. So the theory behind this, therefore, is if online banking is in a way one of the harder things to achieve for the reasons that you've stated, then if we've done that, then we know people are kind of comfortable in other areas, in the sense that we know they've got the digital skills, etc. Now, that is open to kind of challenge and debate, and you're not the first person to raise this question when we started sharing this list around. So we were very open to kind of ending up in a different place. And the personal preferences thing, I think, is an important consideration. So the reason it's put there for consideration is because we sort of felt that if you're doing well on that, you're probably doing well on the other elements of the composite indicator, but very much sort of for people's views, I think.
The other point that I would make, and many members don't need me to tell you this, many of our most deprived communities are not only fresh food deserts, they're also financial deserts as well. There is no physical access to banking facilities at all. And we know that some of the consequences of people being unable to rely on reputable and safe and secure ways of handling money can lead. So I think, while I appreciate it looks a little bit odd, and I think Helen's point is the valid one, that if we can get people to that level of digital literacy, then a lot of the building blocks are in place. I think it is an important issue for us to challenge about financial isolation in our most deprived communities in any event.
Right, I understand better where you're coming from, so it was worth asking the question because the explanation makes sense. But I do reiterate the point, if it needs reiterating, that, you know, a lot of people are now doing online banking, are doing it. The same with you, engagement with utility companies. Whatever you want to look at in the private sector, people are not being given a choice any longer. The same, dare I say, with some local authorities. It's very difficult to find a telephone number to contact a council these days because everybody's being pushed to do it online. And that's great for a lot of people. Lots of people prefer the communication that way. But it's not necessarily the same thing as an indicator of success if people are doing it begrudgingly and because they feel they've no option. And my case is that I think a lot of people who have to interact, not just with banks, but with public utilities and various other organisations, do it because they find that is the only way these days. It's just impossible to speak to a human being in these organisations any longer.
I've got questions stacking up, so that you're not being ignored. I will read out the list. Ahmed first, then Kate, then Elise, then Grace, and now Cecile as well. Ahmed.
Chair, may I suggest that a cluster of 3 questions is taken, perhaps, to expedite the purpose of the meeting quickly, yeah? So I'll try to be brief. Just actually extending the inclusion aspect, perhaps you're aware of the incumbent government's race disparity audit in October. It gives you a series of indicators in terms of the discrimination within the field of employment, housing, and the rest. Poverty deprivation often gets you into some form of discrimination, whether you live in a housing estate, it could be white, working class, and people feel disaffected. So the question about inclusion and the whole modernization process of digitalization in our lives, some people are deprived of it, and that includes also some businesses. So if GMCA wants to, I think Salford model is a good one because they tried their best in penetrating to some of the businesses in particular. So if GMCA wants to take that model and look at combined authority-wide, so we need to look at SMEs and people who are actually not there, so some form of support. And lastly, Chair, I just want to say, perhaps as you're developing this, the strategy is good. It's about penetrating. It's about reaching those parts where others haven't been before. So the model is there. I think the Salford model is a good one, but you need to review it and refine it so people actually can feel the change. There's a tangible difference you're making with the digitalization process. Thank you, Chair.
Remembered. It's quite interesting, this subject coming up, because this morning I was at a board meeting for a housing association that has a huge number of houses in the ward that I represent, and the same issue came up about digital inclusion. Now their approach is very much that, well, actually it saves us a huge amount of money because the cost of contacting a resident through digital means rather than face-to-face is about 1/10 of the cost. So they are putting in practice, in place, lots of ways in which to develop the digital skills of their customers. So this begs the question really about how, you know, are you making sure there is no duplication in terms of what different partners are doing, and are you working with those different partners across Greater Manchester to ensure that there's not the duplication, but you're also learning from each other and making the best of those opportunities from partnership working? Thank you.
Third question we'll take is Elise. So we can do all 3, and then we've got 3 left over, so we'll do another pack of 3, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay. Are we on? I just wanted to talk actually inclusion, but in the opposite way round. So those who are really up to date with their digital, with their technology, everything is digital, they're frustrated that systems are not in place, the software doesn't deliver what they're after, you know, and how we're going to actually address that. In terms of online banking, I think actually I agree that that's quite an important measure. I think in terms of online banking, your mobile phone, the number of times you just use your mobile phone to pay for something directly out of your bank account. And I think that there is a real demand for that kind of technology, and people are actually wanting to use that. And I think in my ward, some of the people in the poorest areas, the only piece of technology they have is their smartphone. And I think everything is done through that smartphone, and that is incredibly important way of communicating for them. And so I think the digital banking, so they're quite technically savvy, some of them, because they use that a lot and they feel quite comfortable communicating in that way. Whereas actually, if they were to come into a meeting with a few of us in our suits and in our big town halls, they actually can find that quite intimidating. Whereas actually, to communicate via a messaging system or through their devices is really important. And so I think my question is about how much that plays an important role within this strategy, and how reassuring me that that's actually, in terms of inclusion, we're looking at the other end as well.
Okay, thank you. I think the first comment is useful, and all we can say at that stage is we just want it to feed those things back in. On the second question, part of the task of this strategy is to bring together everything that's working already, and certainly when I was first picking this portfolio up, I've been stunned by how much really good stuff in different agencies and different parts of Greater Manchester is going on. So this isn't about reinventing stuff at all, and I think the people that you're talking about are represented on the subgroups under the 5 themes. And if we found we haven't got somebody they're invited, I think maybe one of the things we might have done was circulate the people who are on the digital steering group, because that's a huge range of agencies and expertise. Yes, can give you complete assurance of that. It's equally as important that we keep ahead of the game and we keep using the expertise of those who are far more expert than other parts of the system. That will be reflected in the bid that we talked about earlier, whereas Greater Manchester, we want to put a bid forward for the next level of sort of infrastructure to keep us ahead of the game. So it's trying to bring all of that together, really.
We've now got Grace, Cecile and Clive, so just going straight to each other's questions.
Chris.
Oh, sorry, Chris. I said Clive. Chris, sorry. Clive's over there.
Thank you. Jobs. Just because obviously, you know, the increasing kind of digitisation of every sector, as well as enormous potential, there is a lot of concern about the future for jobs at a certain skill level, I suppose. And while the kind of skills and talent strand sort of addresses that in a way, I wonder whether it would be useful to have something more explicit in here about ensuring that everybody becomes more prosperous as a result of increasing digitisation rather than less, if that makes sense.
Shall I just answer that? Thank you for the comment, and I think we can make that link more explicit through to the Greater Manchester strategy, where that is very explicit about more prosperity for everybody. Thank you.
Sorry, Cecile, and then straight into Chris.
And just another thing about inclusion. I'm sure all the councillors here, as well as myself, have had inquiries from people who have no digital skills, and quite often it's the older generation. And they get very upset, you know, at being that they feel excluded and they feel unable to be included. But what I've found is that one of the best ways for them is through the libraries, because quite often the librarians are very sympathetic, will give them the time and will help them to do what they want. They stand back when it's something confidential. I've watched them doing it, but to actually get the screen up and show them how to use it, it's one of the best ways.
Yes, pretty much similar to Gracie's point, and it's about how the this potential within this industry. I mean, paragraph 2 on the second page, it's got the figures in there about how much the industry workers benefit the economy more, and it's about ensuring the benefits go to all areas and not just located in one specific location.
Yes, thank you for those comments. I think we've already picked up that one on the older people, actually. And I think it's Barclays also do something with older people in community settings, not just in the banks. And yeah, we'll make sure that connection is made through. Thank you.
Well, I will draw to a close, but I've got a couple of observations to make. The first thing is that, as I understand it from my discussion with Helen, this isn't just digital per se, it's also the wider perspective, which includes there for things like AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics, etc. And therefore, there's another dimension that we need to be aware of here, and that is over the next N years, when all these things develop, there's going to be jobs, if you like, that will get lost inevitably. So we need to think that as part of the agenda going forwards. So it's the way forward in terms of this is what is going to happen in the whole of the world. So we can't be Luddites, but there are important considerations. And a little while ago I went around the Jaguar factory in Castle Bromwich. When you see the robotics there, you can see why Jaguar cars are doing so well in this country. So there's some fantastic opportunities, but there is a downside as well. The next thing I would like to observe, I'm really delighted that we're being taken on board cybersecurity. I've chaired a number of audit committees over the years, and almost invariably, in the public sector and also types of the private sector, one of the greatest concerns is cybersecurity, and we need to be involved with that, both as an authority and also in terms of wider advice, etc. And the final 2 points I would like to make is a bit of a process, really. On number 7, your alignment in terms of the priority action for the next 6 months, I think we should have some actual target dates rather than a vague next 6 months. And then, if it's reporting back, we can measure that progress. And secondly, I think with regards to the measure that we got on page 5 of the report, I would still like a better understanding of the general rationale behind what the changes have been to take out the nester, if you like, figures, to get to things that you're looking at, and perhaps to populate, if you like, this table a bit more. I totally and absolutely agree that the social measure is very, very important, that we need to be considering the impact there. So it's not just about industry, it's not just about improving things. Great example, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of healthcare and what the opportunities are for diagnosis at home is a good example, perhaps. So there's some fantastic opportunities here that we need to take on board. I welcome the report. It's a good way forward. Looking forward to the 8th of December, and then looking forward to the next update coming to this committee. So thank you very much indeed. Right, so we're now on to the next report, which is employer engagement. Now, somehow or other, it's not a big building, but we've lost Sean Anstey. But I'm reliably informed that Simon is more than capable of delivering this report. I didn't say that. No, I said that, and I'm allowed to say it.
Thanks, Chair. Again, I'll assume that people have read the report, but just to highlight a number of points. We've been thinking for some time about how we strengthen the link between the education and skills agenda particularly and employers, and that really important link. We're in a situation where a lot of schools particularly want to work more strongly with employers but find it difficult to know how to do that, and an awful lot of employers want to work and offer experience to schools but again find it difficult to know how to do that. And this, therefore, this employer engagement framework has come out from that whole area of work. we talked in para 16, just to pick up on a specific point there about, and the Mayor mentioned it earlier, about Sir Richard Lee's doing work on an employment charter and working with employers and the consultation on that. The timescales have just slipped slightly from what was outlined in the paper, so that work will now happen early in the new year, rather than it starting in November, as mentioned in that paragraph. The engagement framework that went to the Combined Authority earlier in the year had five priorities to it. One was about that engagement with schools that I've talked about. The second is about ensuring that all employers are developing their workforces, so they're taking responsibility for their workforce, both the individual and the employer, to actually develop and train those individuals in work to enable them to reach their maximum potential. The third was about how we, as Jim mentioned earlier, we run a number of programs for supporting people who are long-term out of work back into work, working with Job Centre Plus and DWP. Actually, how do we engage employers in that process? Because unless employers are willing to take on people who've previously been long-term unemployed, then actually the chances of people getting back into work are far less. The fourth area is about having healthy workplaces. There's an awful lot of evidence around the fact that kind of good employment and healthy workplaces make for productive businesses, and therefore we wanted to work with employers about how we can help make Greater Manchester workplaces more healthy workplaces. And the final one was really around the role of procurement in delivering social value, and that's obviously, you know, initially an action that local authorities and combined authority can drive, NHS, etc. But it's also about encouraging employers to think about their role in terms of how they use their procurement to drive the wider social impacts that they're having as an employer. Priority 4 then just briefly says what we are planning to do in the first 6 months. Behind that, there's 5 priorities. There's a detailed ambition and plan. And what we've just pulled out is the things we want to focus on in the first 6 months. Things that we believe we need to make early progress on, things that we believe we can make some initial impact in. The first of those is about trying to make sure that every young person has an engagement with an employer in every year of their secondary education. We know for a fact that if a young person has 4 engagements with an employer in their secondary education, they're 25% less likely to be out of work or not in education or in employment or training in later life. So that early engagement with employers is vital, and we want to make sure every young person has an encounter every year of their secondary school. The second is around apprenticeship. As you will know, employers now are levied. If they're large employers, they are levied on potentially their payroll, and that money is then used to fund apprenticeship training within that individual employer. Obviously, therefore, the public sector in Greater Manchester is a major levy payer and therefore a major recipient of levy funds. So we estimate that the total levy payments within Greater Manchester are about £60 million, public and private. Of that 60 million, the public sector is paying about £20 million of that. And what we want to do is ensure that that is used in the public sector to the best possible advantage to make sure we have an apprenticeship programme that we can generally be proud of across the whole of the public sector. The third area is that area of working with employers, as I said, to engage unemployed individuals, so a joint work with Job Centre Plus, and enhancing the offer that we have to unemployed individuals through Job Centre Plus. The fourth is around the employment charter that Andy already mentioned, and then the fifth is as I said, around the kind of social value and procurement particularly, and particularly focusing on how we roll out public sector social value. I mean, already for a large number of the contracts that we issue have at least 20% of the scoring of those contracts on social value, but we want to make sure how we can roll that out more consistently and more fully across certainly combined authority, but also local authority procurement activity.
Questions? Susan and then Chris.
Thank you, Chair. This agenda, employers' willingness to take the long-term unemployed on as employees, I'm interested in anything else you can say to me about, so when that occurs, is there anything raised at the moment about coaching and support needs of those new employees? And then an area I'm particularly interested to hear about. This is how I would explain it. So it would be those same employers then being willing to sustain the secure employment of those who have come from the long-term unemployment route. It's like there's a pathway there, it feels, where we would want in some way, can we have any role in ensuring, you know, within those first years that we don't have too much dropout? Are we paying attention to that, especially if we're putting money at this whole business, which we are? You mentioned the Working Well scheme. Sounds like it's government money, isn't it? It's devolved government money. But one would want to know that we're spending every pound as well as we can. So surely retention, rather than revolving, rather than revolving door perhaps from one employee to another and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I won't be greedy. I'm just making 3 very quick points. With regards to engagement with schools and colleges, are we going to be coordinating that locally with council so as to avoid duplications? With regard to the 7C on the annex and the apprentice programmes, it states its first flagships launched. Are there any more details of what those flagships may be? And finally, with the employment charter, we've got a fair employment charter in Oldham, and I'm sure some other boroughs will have. Are we going to make that, or is the plan for that to be a standard charter across the whole of the conurbation?
Please.
Yeah, thank you. I really welcome this and this report, and I think there's some really, really positive things in it. I feel, though, that there's caution in terms of where skills training is delivered to the detriment of lifelong learning and wider education. And I think the time where jobs were for life isn't a reality anymore. So we need to ensure that where business is delivering skills, it's not to the detriment of them understanding that those are transferable skills, and there's a wider education that allows individuals, people, to be able to get another job somewhere else doing something slightly different, and that it's not that specific that they feel that tied to what they're doing.
Simon?
Yep. Thank you very much. Very much welcome those comments. In terms of the first point about supporting people when they are new into employment, there are a couple of things that we're doing there, particularly around the Working Well programme, which has now just recently become the Work and Health programme, which is now contracted. So as you say, it's a devolved piece of government money that we now control within Greater Manchester. We are putting in place measures on sustainability of employment and working with individuals to ensure that employment is sustained. I can get more details of that to you. We are also looking at whether we can't put in place some kind of support to people who are in employment, who may be potentially of the likelihood of falling out of employment. So rather than waiting for people to become unemployed, waiting for them to be 6 months unemployed and then intervening, actually whether we can't intervene earlier. And we're looking at potentially doing a pilot around that next year as well. On the issue on schools and colleges and work experience, we are absolutely working through the kind of employment leads or employment skills leads for each of the local authorities, and that will be coordinated across Greater Manchester. So when we talk in the paper about a GM approach, it's not the CA doing it in isolation. It's very much about working with the 10 local authorities. On the flagship apprenticeship programme, there are, I think, 3 programmes that we're currently developing. I haven't actually got the details of them with me, but I'll make sure that information is made available to you, because I think it's areas where there are kind of widespread and common skills across a whole range of the public sector. So kind of where a whole range of the sector needs kind of key skills and core skills, we are making sure those are prioritised for that flagship. So I'll get you details of that. And in terms of the employment charter, very much looking to work with the employment charters that exist across a whole range of the boroughs, actually. Need to think exactly how this will work, and that's one of the reasons we want to take a little bit longer, just to make sure that it's the consultation document is launched in the right way. So that when it happens, it will be very much a consultation document and discussion with employers and with individuals and unions about what they think should be in that, but it'll build on the work that many of the districts have done in their own employment charters. So we won't have people signing up for an Oldham charter and then say, well, how does that relate to the Greater Manchester charter? That will be resolved somehow, but we will resolve that. And then the final point about skills training, lifelong learning. I think it's a very valid point, absolutely. We can do some things with employers. One of the things we are trying to do through some of the work that Andy mentioned earlier is this focus on kind of life readiness for our young people, and making sure that people don't just go through school and get exams, but that they are actually ready for the skills that they will need and the skills that they need to equip them for life more generally. Very much work in progress, but we've talked in the Reform Board when we last had a discussion about this, about it's about resilience, it's about confidence, it's about those skills that not just young people, but individuals need to see them through life. And as you say, people don't have careers anymore. They have a set of skills that they need to manage a working pattern, and quite often have many jobs at the same time, as well as different jobs over their life. Northwest Business Leadership Team recently defined the kind of 5 what they described as Northern Star characteristics. So these are the skills that individuals need for a working life in the north of England, and we're looking at how we build those into an awful lot of the programmes that we run, and as well as the work that we're doing with schools about how they prepare individuals, and particularly young people, for the world of work. But more to come on all of those things, but absolutely welcome the comment, and it's absolutely the direction of travel that we're moving in.
The one we have in Rochester, the chair's upstairs and all the time, it avoids any embarrassment. It's in relation to Annex A, and there's a couple of points really. Number one, there are a number of target dates which have now passed, i.e. the 30th of October. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Have any of those not been achieved? And if so, why? And the second point is, the background papers included a report on the 28th of July, which I looked at, and there's a very interesting annex attached to that, which took the priorities as we got listed down here, but only 4. The 5th priority was obviously added afterwards. But it's got the ask of employers and the offer to ask of employers and the offer to employers, which to me almost looked a bit like brainstorming. But I couldn't really translate how Annex 1 goes into the action plan. And yet when I looked at the action plan, I thought the action plan was excellent. I couldn't find anything that I didn't think was missing. But my second question, therefore, is if one compared the Annex 1 with the action plan, is there anything substantial that's been dropped off the Annex 1 in delivering the action plan? And is that because it's in the too difficult box?
Thanks. I'll deal with the second of those first if I can. Nothing in the background paper has been dropped off informing the action plan. The action plan is those things that we're going to do first, if you like. So all of the things that are in the background paper will happen, but it's the action plan refers to those things that we're going to do first and prioritise for early work. In terms of the Annex A, I will have to double check and come back to you on exactly whether all of those things have happened, but certainly for a number of them. For example, the first one about the toolkit for employers, that has been developed and is going to be launched, I think it's the week after next actually, so it's been done and is ready to be launched, and as well as the second one that has. I'm not sure about the partnership agreement for work experience providers. I'll come back to you on that. I think it's there, but I'm not sure whether it's quite finalised. And the Careers and Employability Advisory Group, I'm pretty sure that has now been sorted in the action taken, but again I'll come back to you on it. So scanning down them, I'm absolutely confident that substantial progress has been made on all of those things where we said we would do that. Whether those exact target dates have been met, I will come back to you on.
That's a very clear answer, and if you could a short email to all members of the committee. And I mean, if there's a slight slippage of the data, so I'm not interested in that, but is there anything else that's been actually missed of importance? I think it's important that we do track these things actually. And I got one very last question actually, which is a bit of a silly question. And it's probably stupid, but in priority 3, there's deeply engaged between employers and JCP. What's JCP stand for? Oh, I knew it was a stupid question. I couldn't get my mind around it. Thank you for that, Simon. That's good. Item 8, which is the the work programme for the Open Scrutiny Committee, and Susan's going to talk to this.
Okay, we used the comments and interests of the committee the first two meetings that you had, and we've tried to translate this into an emerging work programme. Two things I think you should note, and that is it is flexible, so if something sort of creeps up the agenda that you would rather kind of shift around, you know, like please do let us know either during the meeting or, you know, via email, you know, to myself and the chair obviously, and then we'll do what we can to deal with this. One thing that I know that the chair is particularly keen on is for us as officers to get better at forward planning. And so to anticipate some of the, you know, the register of key decisions obviously is very helpful in that it highlights some of the kind of really crucial things, but I have been working with colleagues to tease out stuff that's coming through a little bit later in this municipal year. And so if you will just bear with us, the conversations are taking place and we are trying to flesh the work programme out.
Can I just add to that, actually, that I think this committee really needs to state that we need to see the forward plan ASAP. My concern is that we fill in gaps and we get to the end of the municipal year and we haven't done all the things we should be doing. So it's important, and I know I've sympathised that this year is the first year in this format, and there's obviously going to be teething problems, but we really do need this forward plan. And for next year, it should be in place at the start of the year. You know, our first meeting is June, isn't it?
Yeah.
So by the June meeting, we need to have that forward plan so we can actually plan, if you like, our scrutiny, accordingly. So have I your support for asking for that? Well, Elise first, then.
Yeah, I'm happy to second it. I think it's absolutely crucial that we have, and to, as much as possible, pre-scrutinising things prior to decision, because you could make an adjustment beforehand, really rather straightforward, rather than waiting until after the decision's made and then having to go through a whole hoo-ha to get it changed. So I absolutely support that, and I'm more than happy to second.
Thank you. I noticed there is a gap around March at the moment. I don't think it's leaving it too late, but after the conversation today, I'm absolutely convinced that we need to put something on this work plan about business startup. I mean, it's defined now. We've got the strategy because, of course, it's been launched since our last meeting. But I think it is crucial, and we need to look at it. And I think we should look at it as a separate item. I know we've got enterprise linked to careers, but I think that's going to be very focused on careers from the wording at the side of it. I think we should table that in, actually.
Totally agree. This country, as well as this area, are absolutely fantastic at business startups. And we should be doing all we can encourage to actually make sure that part of our economy develops exceedingly well. As part of that, we've got all the universities in this area, and there's been lots of spin-out companies from the universities. So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I don't think it's too late in the year. I think we should do it then. There is a gap there. Totally agree. Chris.
Yeah, just with reference to the 19th of January meeting with the low skills and long-term unemployed, the questions that are relating why it's related to the Scrutiny Committee, I think it's important that we look at that as a GM-wide. Can we also have those questions answered at an authority level?
Yeah, it's just what I said last time, that our role surely follows the combined authorities role. And for us to have a forward plan without having sight of your forward plan, I think it's, and I mean, other people might be seeing this and doing the work accordingly, but we are not seeing that everything's in line the way it should be.
I would ideally want to have one forward plan. that can then be shared with all the scrutiny committees, so we can be very, very clear about how things are being covered and by whom and where and when. So that's certainly what we're trying to aim to do, to make certain that you've got complete sight of the forward plan moving forward, and then you can make decisions as a committee about what it is you want to look at. And the principle of pre-decision scrutiny is, I'm sure, will fall over our feet from time to time, but that's absolutely where we're seeking to get to.
Just to add to that, actually, we debated the last meeting the importance that all areas are appropriately scrutinised. But bearing in mind we've got 3 committees now, and that nothing falls between, if you like, the planks, but also that there isn't duplication of work as well. So I think, you know, a forward plan for all areas would be exceedingly helpful. Sorry, Cecile.
Okay, thank you. Before Andy was elected, the leaders of the authorities had been working for a few years on the spatial framework, and it was not just focused on housing, it was focused on business growth and economy. I fear that just by concentrating on town centres, we are losing that huge thing. So I would like us to discuss, because I think it had a huge impact on business growth in the conurbation. So can we discuss the impact of spatial framework policies on business growth?
Just to pick up that point, if you go back to the minutes of the last meeting, we actually identified in there the 2 items, which is probably the same in fact, the spatial framework and its impact on industrial land as a topic, and employment land and the spatial framework. I suspect they're both the same actually, but you know, obviously we were doing a bit of brainstorming, so it's important we do it. Absolutely right. And so and we need that sooner rather than later in many ways.
Yes, just reacting to what Andy Burnham said, the Mayor. And again, others may know all these things. In a meeting like this, you always feel you're showing your ignorance. But I'd not heard of the government giving 15 million for trade missions. Now, as a scrutiny panel, it'd be important to study, not next meeting, but I know you've got internationalisation, but I guess they're not all gone anywhere by a few weeks' time. But it'd be interesting to know where they're going, why they're going there, and how much it's costing, and are they spending it all in the bar, you know. So, I'm only being facetious, but as a scrutiny panel, I think it would be interesting to know where they're going, what reason for, how successful they are, and how they're using government money. Thank you. At some point in the future this year.
I'll come back in a second. Eamon, do you want to respond to that?
We'll have a complete picture by the time you meet next time round and look at the internationalisation strategy. I don't know, but certainly our intent is to try and use that strategy to influence the way in which any trade missions are planned and executed, to make sure they're accurately targeted. We can all have our views as to the value of such missions, I think, and perhaps a debate around that. We are trying to make certain that what resources available is more closely targeted. So we'll be able to give you an update on that, but certainly that might be something you want to come back to over the course of the year.
Just an observation, once we've had that paper, which is scheduled for December, perhaps we ought to have a debate as whether or not that would form a good topic for a task and finish group. Perhaps we may think about that for the next meeting.
One final comment from me. It would be ever so helpful if you can be if there's particular things that you'd like covered in presentations when they're coming up, if you could let us know as soon as possible, because it's really helpful for the officers that are drafting it, because quite often we've got these huge topics and it might be that the committee is really interested in a particular aspect of so I've tried to tease out some of your thoughts on those things, but obviously they could be padded out and I might have misunderstood what you've said, so apologies if that's the case, but any clarification would be really, really helpful.
And just to add to that, I mean, I'm an inclusive person. I don't think the chair and the vice chair should dictate the agendas by themselves. I think you need to influence the agendas. It's a committee. is not two people. So the point you're making, Susan, is absolutely spot on.
Thank you, Chair. It's a wonderful thought to having a group looking at internationalisation and which particular country where inward investment or outward and investment coming into the northwest, particularly GMCA areas. Yes, it will be very interesting to have that work group. I don't mind taking part in it, but I was just having a quick one. Right, more seriously, in terms of graphene, we have the Graphene Institute, the European Centre here. And I don't see in the work programme in terms of how that's going to pan out in terms of where we are. So should we have that as in our work programme?
I mean, we had a great presentation about was it about a year ago, year and a half ago? Yeah. So I mean, I'd support that actually. I mean, I suspect that most members of this committee aren't even aware of the deal of graphene. But you might have heard about it, but it's that presentation was absolutely fantastic, wasn't it? So I mean, I would suggest we have it actually. I was trained as a chemist, and I mean, I didn't know anything about graphene. So it's a wonderful opportunity. Sorry, I can't hear it well. The thing on.
We've all heard of it. It's in the Manchester Evening News regularly.
I know that.
And it was mentioned last year at Scrutiny and so on. But I doubt most of us know just exactly how it's being used currently. I don't.
Add something, Nathan, sorry.
Certainly, I mean, I'll talk to Simon outside the room, but we can certainly arrange for a presentation to be brought not only on graphene, but also on some of the work that's being done through the university on advanced materials more generally. But I think there is a degree of impatience. I mean, everyone's been talking about graphene, it's the future, everything's going to be made out of it, we're going to be flying planes made of graphene and all the rest of it. If you look at the NASA implementation metric, it goes from 1, which is concept, to 10, which is full implementation. Graphene's at about 3 in that, so I mean, it is a slow burn. But there is a huge amount of work going on, and obviously there's a huge amount of investment going in. If you go drive past the North Campus, the GEEK building, which is the graphene commercialisation project, is seeing a huge amount of investment. But I think having a presentation to you on graphene and that wider advanced materials work, which is at the heart of the university's global competitive edge, I think would be very useful.
I would welcome that. We sometimes forget actually the quality of the university we've got in this conurbation. Susan, anything else you want to add?
No, I don't say this every time, but on a subject like that, we could go there and have the lecture from them there and show us anything they wanted to. I think that might be a good couple of hours.
If that could be done, it'd be great. I mean, again, going back to the previous scrutiny, when we were talking about the enterprise zone, we had a presentation at the airport and a tour around the airport. So, I mean, all these things are possible, actually. So, I think we'll take that on board and we'll work out the practicalities of it.
I mean, we've been a lead. Manchester's been a lead in science and innovation, but we haven't always seized the manufacturing and the business side of it. Like computers, for example, it was, they were born here in the university. The same with graphene. I mean, I've been reading about it for the last 3 years or so. You know how it's going to be a wonder material, but we have to get the business people in working solidly with the university's research departments to get that out and into the economy.
So we can cover that under this presentation. I've got one last point to make, which is a very minor point actually, but on the minutes again. When we were brainstorming what items were suggested to come onto the plan, we mentioned housing investment. Well, that's not really the remit of this committee, so with your permission, we'll take that off there. So, it's 4 o'clock. So, thank you for your contributions. Some very, very good questions. And thank you, and see you again in December on the 8th.